Yeah, and this is going to be an important one, particularly since the Reagan administration moves from the SALT talks, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, that actually begin in important ways in the Nixon administration. So this isn't just one party versus another. To what the Reagan administration calls START, which is Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties. Actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons.
One thing I noticed is that there's a great change in the Russian leadership, just the numbers. I mean, they just keep dying.
Exactly, exactly. And Reagan will say, they do, and Reagan will say at one point, you know, I wish I could establish exactly that. I wish I could establish a relationship with these leaders, but they keep dying on me. And there is, in fact, this extraordinary turnover, which ends with the other person that I want to talk about here, of course, which ends with Gorbachev coming into power. And we get the whole issue that's going to be really at the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is the relationship between Reagan and Gorbachev and the last Cold Warriors, if you will, in important respects. I think that's exactly right. And with the rise of Gorbachev, you begin to see near the end of this timeline, at least in the second half of this timeline, the series of summits that begin to emerge as Reagan and Gorbachev come together and discuss issues, find a relationship that I think neither really expected in the process. Well, again, my point is not to have you memorize it again. It's just to have you familiarize yourself with some of the issues, some of the matters that are happening. And I think the things that you brought up are exactly two of the important matters to think about with this. Let me make a presentation for a while, and then if you have questions, I can handle them. On the first part of what I want to do in the time available to me, I've listed this, you can see, two interpretations of the last Cold Warriors. And I want to look at two historians who have opined on this. One of them is John Lewis Gaddis, a longtime writer on the Cold War, whose book, The Cold War, A New History, came out a few years ago. Gaddis has been at Ohio University for much of his career, but he's now holding a chair at Yale. He has a great deal of respect, a great deal of influence in the foreign policy community. And his position is, in fact, up against the view taken by George Herrick, our Bible for this particular year, right? And I think it's instructive to think about and mull over how these two individual historians, looking at the same materials, looking at the same facts, looking at the same timeline, if you will, shape and craft interpretations that really are at loggerheads in many important respects. Now the moment of truth, to see if I can push this button and change that slide. Oh my goodness. Yes. Let me start with the interpretation that John Lewis Gaddis presents. And my apologies for using a lot of words here. But as I once read a very witty comment by someone who had written a long letter and said, "My apologies for writing such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a shorter one." And I understand that. Being concise is a challenge a lot of times. Gaddis emphasizes the extent to which Reagan comes along at a particular time in human history, which puts him into a variety of interactions with a number of other people, but a limited number of people who make a difference. So Gaddis would argue. You see, Deng Xiaoping in China, who comes to power after Mao, and who very candidly moves China in the direction of a market economy. Very clear about that. Thatcher, Maggie in the United Kingdom, one of Reagan's strongest supporters. They share an awful lot of similarity in their outlooks about foreign policy, domestic policy, etc. Lech Walesa, who will, of course, be the leader of the labor union in Poland, Solidarity, that challenges the communist government in Poland, eventually becomes, I guess we could say, victorious in this. And Pope John Paul II, an interesting choice, but someone who has a background Polish, the Polish Pope, who lends his voice to the world of foreign policy. What Gaddis emphasizes is what I put here, that they reject the idea of seeing the Cold War as a permanent feature of the international landscape. And Reagan and others would argue that détente, which had been very much the philosophy of, as I say, Nixon, Ford, Carter, etc. Détente accepted the concept that the Cold War was a permanent feature of the international landscape. That, in fact, the United States and the Soviets had to get together, but that they would do so as enemies that needed to find a way of mutually existing on the planet. Gaddis and the people who are essentially favorable to Reagan emphasize that he has a revolutionary point of view in a president. By coming to power saying, no, we will not accept the permanent perpetuation of the Cold War, quite the opposite. We will end this. Not in conflagration, but we will end this thing. We have got to end it. That's how Gaddis, and Gaddis speaks for a number of other historians who are very favorable to Reagan and what he did here. As you see, and I'm quoting from Gaddis there, about Reagan's belief in the power of words and the potency of ideas. Again, it's interesting to see how an historian emphasizes certain aspects and interprets certain aspects of Reagan's behavior. And clearly, if you look at as you were looking over the timeline, you find a few different places, I suspect, where I mentioned Reagan was giving a speech. Reagan gave a speech about this. Reagan